Our first speaker this morning is Cody Desautel. He has served as the Executive Director of the Confederate Tribes of the Colville Reservation since 2022 and President of the Inter-Tribal Council since 2020. Prior to that, he worked for the tribe as a Natural Resource Director, Forest Engineer, Forester, and Fields Planner, and for the BIA as a Natural Resource Officer, Soils Conservationist, and Soil and Inventory Forester. Cody has a bachelor's degree in environmental science from Haskell. Please welcome Cody.
Good morning, everyone. In the home stretch here, so hopefully everybody's found the information they've heard this week useful, and do want to thank Menominee and Stockbridge for the tour yesterday. That was amazing. Always interesting to see how they manage things in different parts of the country. So first, and maybe most importantly this morning, where's my Knicks fans at? Go Knicks! 29-point deficit. It's been a long time since I've seen the Knicks win. I'm so used to watching them lose to the Bulls back in the day. So I didn't mention this Tuesday morning, but I should have, because this is a pretty important thing. So ITC, although this is the 49th annual Timber Symposium, ITC is actually 50 years old, and you've seen the stickers and the logos that we've updated. So I think we talked a bit about how ITC's got started over the years, but originally the organization was formed in 1976. So the organization is older than many of us on the board, and looking back at all of the things that it was formed for and how we've transitioned over the years is really kind of amazing. That really was formed to improve the relationship with the BIA, and now we're involved in so many things, including international affairs this year. But just wanted to note that. So I'm going to cover a few things, and some things maybe in not as much detail because I'll have Matt follow up. But I want to give kind of a funding and staffing update for where ITC is as an organization. As you know, we hired an executive director, Cal Mukamoto, last year. We've been diligently working to fill out some additional positions that are in need for us. As I noted, since our responsibilities have increased, so has our need for staffing, that we always asked a ton of the board and Laura and Monica, and we don't have the capacity to do that without some additional help these days. Also wanted to give an update on tribal management legislation. Again, I'll just touch on those briefly because Matt will have more detail in his presentation. Talk a bit about the service reorg and kind of ITC's engagement with it. And we'll have Juice and Aaron that will give a more detailed update on that as well later. Talk a bit about the European Union deforestation regulation work that we've done this year. That's an ongoing project. We didn't quite get where we wanted to go after a couple trips, but we are seeing it impact at least some contracts in Indian country already, and think there might be more to come, and have concerns about what they call the Brussels effect, where we're concerned that this policy will be the kind of benchmark that they use for international policy, and how that might affect markets that tribes have available to them. And then just a brief snippet about appropriations. Again, Matt will cover that in more detail, but wanted to touch on it briefly because that's a pretty important thing to the folks in this room. So first start with, as part of our workforce initiative build out, well, we received an additional $2 million from the BIA to really contribute to what we see as like a fire assignment type of scenario for current tribal employees and internships to help with the timber strike team. So that's been a successful model for the BIA for several years. I pointed out Ryan Frandino Tuesday morning. I'm not sure, Ryan, are you in here this morning? All right, same spot even. So this is something that we're excited about. We've talked about workforce. We've had a workforce development strategic plan for many years, but it's just hard to get traction on that. And largely it's funding limited. So this is an opportunity for us to, again, add a tribal component of something that functions very similar to the timber strike team, and will support the work of the strike team with participation from, again, tribal employees and interns. So the funding that we have allocated, almost the entirety of the $2 million budget will help to reimburse tribes for the tribal employees that go participate as part of the team. So for those of us that are familiar with fire assignments, it'll function very similar to that. You would sign think we're going to develop an availability form that says when they can go. We can look at the timber strike team schedule, which I think is largely complete for the year, to see where they have interest in working, and then we'll send them, and ITC can help cover their per diem, their salary costs. We're going to buy some equipment so we make sure that they're equipped when they go to the field. So an exciting thing that we're looking forward to. We also expect to recruit interns, although we don't have the RFP or the advertisement for that developed yet. We see this as a mechanism to bring on and recruit some of those kids coming out of high school or at the midpoint of their careers in college, so we can start to engage them in tribal forestry and hopefully find them a home before they graduate, because we realize in the past some of the other federal agencies that have had different hiring authorities have gotten to them before either the tribes or the BIA have. So we're hoping this is a mechanism to create a pathway to get them into either tribal or BIA jobs. So that is all we have about that. For funding and staffing, additionally, so we've got a participating agreement with the U.S. Forest Service that was approved on September 10th. The agreement is $5 million over 5 years, and it's intended to expand the use of Good Neighbor Authority and the Tribal Forest Protection Act. So this is something that was included in the 2018 Farm Bill, expanding the Good Neighbor Authority and adding 638 contracting ability to the Tribal Forest Protection Act. And we've been pretty successful on the TFPA side, although we have not made much progress on the GNA side, primarily due to some, I think, an oversight in the drafting language that didn't allow tribes to maintain program revenue. So we think that's been addressed with the Explore Act. We continue to work on some legislation that will make it more explicit, so there's no opportunities for future Office of General Counsels in the Forest Service to interpret it differently. But we think this will be a good mechanism. We've seen tribes utilize this authority where they generate revenue from forest management activities, and then that is used on future projects to cover the planning and NEPA costs. So we're excited about this because in a number of different authorities in the past, the tribes have had the ability to do work on federal ground next door, but there hasn't necessarily been funding that was allocated or appropriated for it. So we think this is a good mechanism. Tribes have some ability to plan those projects, ensure there's enough of an economic component that they can cover the planning in NEPA on the future projects. So hopefully kind of a self-perpetuating cycle that helps fund some of those restoration needs. We also hope that through those funding sources that we recognize that BIA is limited in funding. We're still working on IFMAT implementation, but the 23 report said essentially the same thing that the previous 3 did, that Indian Country is vastly underfunded compared to other federal agencies. But we also recognize that there's a lot of competition for appropriations on the BIA side because of the scope of BIA's responsibilities. So I've mentioned this over the last couple symposiums that I think hopefully the model moving forward for Indian Country is not just BIA funding that helps support our programs, but funding from several governmental agencies, maybe some state agencies, and particularly or potentially even some NGO funding at some point in the future. So we also think that with these there can be some alignment with U.S. Forest Service action plans. We've done a fair bit of work on that this year. The Forest Service is revising theirs. There was some things accomplished in the previous administration's plan, and we've looked at like a 4-year model where we kind of look at items that we could accomplish over a particular administration to make sure that we continue to make progress on that. So ITC has 4 funding sources at this point over the next couple of years, $6.88 million. Total includes our BIA cooperative agreement, our BIA workforce initiative, our U.S. Forest Service agreement, and then we've got the agreement with NRCS. All complementary, really looking at either work on reservations or work with our federal partners. And then we're continuing to build out the ITC staffing capacity with a 5-year goal of reaching a staffing of around 17. As we get closer to the end, we'll be able to determine if 17 is really the number we need, but we're trying to be strategic about where we fill those, recognizing that additional funding comes with additional administrative burdens, and we've asked a ton of Laura and Monica in the past, and we're trying to get them some help, and Cal's working pretty diligently to try to figure out what that org structure looks like and what our priorities are for hiring to make sure that we're getting those most important positions in place first. And then ITC's investments continue to do well under the supervision of our Finance Committee Chair, Tim. ITC's really had a goal of trying to maintain enough in their investment account that we've got continuity, that when we have uncertainty in federal funding sources, like we've seen with several of these government shutdowns over the last few years, and typically CRs going into the first 3 to 6 months of any given year, that there's not always certainty that those federal funding sources are going to be available when the fiscal year starts. So we always want to make sure we have the ability to operate to maintain the work and momentum that we've gained. So that means having some finances on our own side of the house. Moving on to tribal management legislation, many of these bills we've worked on for at least a couple years and have made good progress. There seems to be largely bipartisan support, but in a lot of situations, getting these bills moved is at least somewhat dependent on other bills that are lined up in front of them that Congress sees as a higher priority. So one that we worked on with Congressman Westerman for many years to get to draft text was actually introduced by Representative Hurd. It's the Fostering Opportunities to Restore Ecosystems Through Sound Tribal Stewardship, or the Forest Act for the acronym. They do a good job naming things in Congress so that you've got a very good acronym to describe the text. But again, sponsored by Representative Hurd. We testified in a hearing back on May 20th of 2025, which included ITC and 3 other tribal witnesses. We haven't seen much progress on this, but we're hoping to continue that. We've been very engaged on the Fix Our Forest Act that was introduced by Chairman Westerman. We think, or we hope, that once we get that one through Congress, or once Congress approves that, that will kind of clear the slate for some of these other tribal bills. This one is one that added a number of different authorities to tribes to do work on adjacent federal land. We continue to work on the technical assistance from the Forest Service. We've heard some concerns from that side of the house, but the chief and OTR have been very supportive of making those connections. And again, I think it's largely a solicitor's issue in their shop. Moving on to the Tribal Self-Determination and Co-Management and Forestry Act, sponsored by Representative Huffman. So although we have Republicans in control of the House, this seems to be a bill that had a lot of traction because they talked about it when we testified on behalf of the Forest Act, and we think that maybe the bill language from these two things may be combined, or components of them included in some larger forestry bill or something like the Farm Bill at some future date. It really builds on that co-management, co-stewardship concept that was part of the past administration. But again, there seems to be strong support in Congress for giving tribes additional authorities to do work on adjacent federal land. The Indian Trust Management Reform Act. This is a big one we've worked on for many years. For those of you that aren't familiar, the Indian Trust Asset Reform Act was passed almost exactly 10 years ago. It had 3 provisions in it, one of which was to authorize Indian Trust Asset Management Plans as a demonstration project, where if tribes developed those plans and had them approved by the Secretary, they could carry out those functions without federal oversight. So they would have approval authority without having to go to their superintendent, for example. So this is set to expire on June 22nd. We've done a lot of work to get that to the finish line. Obviously, we don't think we were going to get that done congressionally before June 22nd, but we've been in communications with the Secretary's office, and we're hopeful we're going to get an extension on that. We've heard maybe 5 years, which concerns me a bit. That's maybe too long. I'd like to see maybe a year to keep this at the top of the priority list. But again, this seems to be one that there seems to be bipartisan support for, so it's just a matter of getting it high enough on the priority list for Congress to get that passed. But we think ITAR is really the next step in self-determination. It's really the first bill that's been passed since the Indian Self-Determination Education Assistance Act back in 1975, so we were definitely due for some additional authorities after 40-ish years. And then for the Farm Bill, the House passed their version of it. I think that was a week or two ago. Don't have a companion bill on the Senate side. That's what we saw back in 2024 as well, as the Biden administration was on its way out. I think this version is slightly lighter on tribal forestry language. So we'll have to work with the Senate side to see where we can get those things added that we've asked for in the past. I'm not very hopeful that's probably going to move very far this year with the midterm election coming up in November. But something we'll continue to work on, and again, the Farm Bill is something we've had a lot of success putting rider language on in the past. Moving on to the Wildland Fire Service reorganization. Again, I won't talk in too much detail about this because we've got Juice and Aaron up here to speak about it. But as we noted, the decision was made to unify all DOI functions under the Wildland Fire Service. There's been executive orders and secretarial orders that have helped work on this. It included all of the bureaus within Interior. So now those from BIA, BLM, Parks, and Fish all serve under the Wildland Fire Service. And I think they made that official for all of the staff about a month or two ago. I think April was the day everybody officially became Wildland Fire Service employees. I would say the service has been good about asking how tribes are incorporated into this. That seems to be a bit of a blind spot for them, particularly since many of the people in leadership roles are from outside the BIA and don't really know how Tribal 638 contracting and compacting works or what tribal self-determination means. So they created the Office of Tribal Trust, which reports direct to the chief, which thankfully they appointed Aaron to be the director of, so that we have that earpiece directly with the chief to make sure he's aware of issues we're seeing in Indian country, and we have the ability to advocate at a high level. The regions have also been reorganized, so the former regions of the former bureaus no longer exist. They've been reorganized into geographic areas that really function like the GACs historically, with a chief that sits above each of those geographic areas, but there's some work to do on that side. Some of the positions are filled, some of the geographic areas have more staffing than others, but that's something we'll continue to give feedback on, because obviously fire is slightly different depending on where you are in the country, so maybe not every geographic area should be structured exactly the same, and we're going to continue to engage on that. The 2026 appropriations bill also required that the Secretaries of Ag and Interior contract with an independent organization to conduct a further assessment of consolidation that would include the Forest Service. We think that GAO was going to do that and was quickly told, no, you're not. They have some idea about who they want to do that. I haven't really seen details on that, but I presume that report is due around this fall, and suspect if Congress thinks they should take action on it, they will probably try to do it within this Congress. But I will say that if the decision is made to move the Forest Service over, that's a huge change. And I would say probably increases the current Wildland Fire Service's capacity or workforce by like 200%, and the funding by probably a similar number. The Forest Service, I think I've heard numbers as high as 2/3 or 3/4 of the Forest Service workforce is on the fire side. So that will be a huge challenge, and I would say that the work we've accomplished over the last year, if the Forest Service comes over, we're almost back to the drawing board, because it's such a huge addition. And I'd also note that if you looked at the president's budget, which if you haven't, I encouraged folks last night, don't look at it. It's not particularly good for Indian country. But you may want to note that that's the only place you saw a significant increase, that the Wildland Fire Service saw a huge increase in staffing and funding. And that wasn't really an increase. It was just movement of that budget and those staff from USDA over to the DOI side. And then this was a new thing for us. If you would have told me 5 years ago you're going to go to Europe to talk about international forest policy and how it impacts tribes, I would have, nah, there's no way we're ever going to Europe. But here we are. We went twice this spring. And it's something that I never really thought about or never followed, but we did start to see the impacts of this. There was a documentary put out by Cow Creek where they had an example of how this regulation, which was passed in 2023, impacted a market they were going to sell into in Japan, where they were requiring tribes to give specific GIS information about the stands they were harvesting to ensure that it doesn't meet the deforestation or degradation standards for this European Union law. So the intent of the law is good. We've made that very clear to European officials we've talked to, whether that's the European Commission or members of European Parliament, that the intent of the law is to restrict the selling of forest products that come from areas that have high levels of deforestation around the world, so that they're not contributing to the deforestation. The challenge is they have high, moderate, and low-risk countries, and the vast majority of countries are low-risk countries, including the U.S. and Canada. And what they said is that 97% of the deforestation comes from 10 countries in particular, which makes you wonder why they even included a low-risk category if getting those first or top 10 countries could
could have addressed the issue with almost all of the deforestation, but that's not how they did it. And it's been a challenge trying to get them to, one, acknowledge that they should have consulted, because the bill has language about protection of indigenous rights and indigenous people and consulting with indigenous people, and they didn't do that at all. And I mean, there was a certain member of parliament that when we talked to him and was explaining that, what did consultation look like? How did you get feedback from indigenous nations? And he said, because I said, in the U.S., we manage 56 million acres total in reservations and almost 20 million acres in timber ground. And he said, we never even thought about U.S. tribes. So a huge oversight on their part. We've heard similar concerns from other industries that are impacted by this regulation, people that produce cocoa or soybeans or leather. I mean, there's a number of different things that this includes that contribute to deforestation. But we made 2 trips back, one in January, one in March, to try to educate the European Union and Commission on what the impacts to Indian country could be, and made some success. I would say the comments we heard in the March trip were considerably better. The January trip was, what are you guys doing here? Essentially, that we got this right. Tribes are happy about it, again, having not talked to any tribes. But I think by the time we went back in March, they'd realized this was a huge oversight. But we do know that when this law was passed, it was part of what they called the Green Deal, I think, that they had largely a liberal controlled government, and that has since changed. So the concern is they need to reopen the law to address some of the issues that are affecting Indian country, but they're concerned that if they reopen the law, that a more conservative government that has control now will repeal it in its entirety. So we're continuing to engage with NAFO on what that communication looks like. We've got an op-ed that we're putting out over there. We're continuing to reach out to members of the European Parliament, but recognize the concerns that tribes have about sharing information, and would say that we see that request getting pushed down the supply chain. So, I mean, Menominee is one of the rare examples in the country where you've got your own mill, that you could have some control of that GIS data that went out, but for the vast majority of us selling timber, we would have to submit that information to the local mill or log buyer we're selling to, and then where it goes from there, we have no control of. And what we've started to see is, in the Cow Creek scenario, although that wood isn't necessarily going directly to a European market, other international markets are trying to preserve the opportunity to sell their wood into the European market at some point. So they're requiring this information, even though it's not necessarily pertinent to what they're doing with it right now. So we're going to continue to work on that. We think we'll probably get some more updates in July, but it's supposed to go into effect January 1 of 2027. So we've got some work to do on that. And then lastly, I'll just touch on appropriations briefly, because again, Matt's going to go into more detail on that. The president's budget was released in early April, had massive cuts across many government departments, including BIA. It would have reduced BIA top-line funding by just over 25%. Thankfully, the House version is already out, because I know there was a lot of fear in Indian country after they'd seen the president's budget. But the House version looks largely flat, and actually even had some increases, in particular to tribal forestry. We went from a $3 million increase from $63 million last year to $66 million this year. Again, this is just the House interior version. It hasn't made it to the House floor yet. We haven't seen the Senate version yet, but that's a good starting point, much better than we thought we were with the president's budget. So that's something that we'll continue to work on. ITC usually always testifies for appropriations, and we did that again this year. So in March, we went back and explained why this funding is so critical to tribes, but as I noted last night in the general membership meeting, I was on the second day in the afternoon, so I stayed to see what comments Chairman Simpson had about what he'd heard from the tribal hearings and testimony in the previous 2 days, and he said he'd never heard so much about law enforcement. So I think there's likely going to be some additional funding when we look at tribal priorities that goes toward law enforcement. Again, we've seen tribes continue to expand the use of the 105L leasing authority, and contract support costs are still a big issue. So even though we see increases in top-line budgets for BIA, we don't necessarily see a lot of that coming to forestry, unfortunately. Again, we're going to continue to raise awareness on that and lobby for funding and how important that is to tribes. And we've even changed our messaging a bit to kind of note that some of the social issues that have become high funding priorities for tribes can be addressed if forests are healthy, if tribes have good natural resource programs, and the tribal membership are using those in more culturally appropriate ways, instead of doing some of the things that have caused some of these social issues. So with that, I don't know that I've got much time for questions. I think I'm very close to on time. Anything very, very quick? I know that was fast. I was joking with the guys up here. Are there Dumb and Dumber fans in the room? Or Ace Ventura, it was in Ace Ventura. You know, at the beginning, when they say, I'm glad you asked that question, he goes, that's what it felt like up here before I started this. And I think I probably delivered on that, and I talked fast to start with.